Excellent, works. I changed the title slightly, so art and science, because assessment is really about the science, but art and assessment have alliterations, so that's why we went with that. First of all, I need to apologise for this slide. Our legal department insists that this goes on the front of every page, so I'll just wait for you all to catch up with that. No, let's move on. Hello, I'm Ben. I'm Selection Assessment Lead for Shell, which means I oversee the use of our assessments for selection. Well, it's in the title, isn't it? For our graduate, our experienced hires, for our executive hires, and also do a lot of work internally with assessment as well. I'll make one admission. Although I'm in-house now, I've only been in-house for a relatively short time, for about 18 months or so. Previously, my career was on the vendor side of things. So I worked for IBM Connexa, and I developed and deployed and sold online assessments, assessment center, interviews, whole range of things. So when I'm talking to you today, I'm talking, from the perspective of looking after assessment within Shell, but also from the perspective of someone who's also worked with a range of other organizations, maybe some of the organizations represented here today, and also large and small. So what I don't want you to do is to switch off when you think, well, our company only has 100, 200 people, not the 90,000 or so people that Shell has. Because I'm going to touch on the different ends of the scales of how we use assessment, from high volume to low volume. Something there for each of you. So simply the topics, rather presented agenda, 3 things we're going to look at. Why do we assess in the first place? What do we assess? How do we know what we're looking for? And then how. So when I finish, we'll have time for some Q&A, and then again, roundtable discussions, and if it's okay, I'll hover around you in the roundtable discussions. If there's any questions about assessment, do feel free to ask me. So, first of all, why do we assess in the first place? Well, first of all, hands up, who use assessments in their recruitment process at the moment? Hands up. Okay, so that looks about somewhere between a third and a half. Okay. I'll point to 3 questions that I would ask about using assessments. First of all, what's the business need? Now, the business need might be, let's say, in our case for our graduate recruitment, we have tens of thousands of applicants, we have less than 1,000 roles, so we need some way to efficiently identify the most promising candidates and to rapidly, what's the term we're using these days? Regret those candidates who are less likely to be a fit for the role. The business case there is that it saves our recruiters literally thousands of hours by allowing them to focus their resources on the candidates who are most likely to be successful or most likely to pass later stages in the assessment process. But then if we look at the other end of the scale, let's say when we're recruiting experienced hires, and this will be a situation you'll be familiar with. You've got one role, you have 15 applicants. Well, are you going to interview all 15 of them? You could, but you want a way of helping to identify which ones, again, you want to spend your time and resource with. And on the other side of it, you don't want to waste the candidate's time. You don't want to be inviting candidates who are not suitable for the role to sit through an interview. It's not good use of their time or yours. And when I talk about assessment, I'm talking about not just the online tests, cognitive ability, personality assessments. I'm talking about everything that we use to help identify whether any given candidate will perform in the role. And that includes CVs, application forms, interviews, anything that you might use in that process. That all wraps up, it rolls up into assessment. So there's a couple of reasons why we use assessment. So what is it that we want to assess? Now, this is a question that comes up a lot. So we've got this whole library of assessments that we could use, but what do we choose for a role? Do we use some kind of intelligence assessment? Do we look for personality? And if so, what kind of personality are we looking for? Do we assess for skills? So a very early question is, well, what is it that we need to assess? How do we assess this candidate to give us as much information about their potential future job performance as possible? And then finally, what candidate experience do you want? You could have your candidates sit through a really valid predictive battery of assessments that takes 4 hours, but is that really a comfortable experience for them? What message does that give about your organization? So we're always thinking about candidate experience. Now, I won't go into too much detail in this one, because I know we've got other speakers today who are talking about candidate experience and have a lot more to say. So I'm going to give a couple of examples here. We're going to go from the large scale to the small scale. So we have every year about up to 1,000 roles for our graduates. That 1,000 role depends on the oil prices. The oil price goes down, effectively that number goes down as well. That's just how the market works. But regardless of how many roles we have, typically we have 100,000 or more candidates globally. So how do we get from 100,000 down to less than 100,000? Less than 1,000? This is what we put in place currently. So we use online assessment, we use cognitive, to measure intelligence, and we use a personality assessment. We do video interviews as well. This is something that's just gone live in April. So candidates get videoed on-demand video, so they watch questions, they respond to it, gets recorded, and then that gets rated by a recruiter. Of course, we use recruiter screening as well to help identify those candidates who then come to the final stage of the assessment, which is remote assessment. So we run interview and case study remotely using the video interviewing platform. So what that enables us to do is, yes, to focus our attention on those candidates who are most promising at each stage of this, and at each stage we're able to deselect candidates. But what it also enables us to do using the assessment is it rapidly speeds up the process. Now, I'm not going to tell you what our time to hire was before we implemented this, but it was shocking. Months, just probably one of the longest time to hires I've seen. But by putting this in place, by making use of online assessments, remote assessments, etc., then it brings it down to a much more manageable, perhaps 30 days or so. So that has an effect on the candidate experience in that we're not hanging around for ages waiting to offer them a role. You look at some of what other organizations are doing. I think Vodafone, for instance, is bringing down their time to hire, measured in weeks, 1 to 2 weeks. There's a lot of potential there, and they're leveraging assessments to help do that. So that's an example from one end of the scale. Let's have a look at experienced hire recruitment. So we take on somewhere, probably about 400 or 500 different experienced roles each year, not counting our business operations centers. I'll come back to those. So for any one given role, we might have 15 applicants. So how do we select the best person for that? Well, this is what we do. We do CV screening, so the recruiter, along with the hiring manager, will go through the process of identifying the most promising candidates. There's a phone interview with the recruiter, and for candidates who have passed that, then they're invited into the in-person final stage where they do interview and presentation. One thing you'll notice there is that we don't do online assessment there, because the business case for it, the ROI, is not necessarily there. If we have a small pool of candidates, it's pretty simple to review those CVs, identify which ones to take through to the next stage. But what is crucial is that this piece here, the interview and presentation and the phone interview, has to be good quality, has to be delivered by people who know what they're doing. And I don't know whether you've seen some recent figures about how effective interviews are, structured versus unstructured. Unstructured interviews generally are just terrible. They're not predictive, potentially biased, all sorts of things. So what we do is we've got a structured interview. Like many of you probably use competency-based interview. That's part of it. There's a professional or technical interview as well. But what we do is make sure that our interviewers meet a standard. Now, I'm fairly new to Shell, so I can't take any credit for the standards that have been put in place for interviewers, but we require each of them, first of all, to have a certain amount of experience and seniority within the organization. They then need to come to a 2-day workshop. Now, out of all the organizations I worked with, there's very few that do that. I've done interview training when I was in my other role as a vendor that was like 2 hours long. So to have 2 days is fantastic, and that 2 days includes a sign-off, so that if they're not up to scratch during the practice sessions of day 2, then they don't get to interview until they've demonstrated their skills. That means that the quality of the interviews, and that's what we depend on to get the very best candidates in role, should be good. We also monitor a lot of this stuff, and one benefit of being a large organization is we have a lot of data. So we can see patterns in interview scoring, we can see which interviewers are giving high scores on average, which ones are giving low. And having that data is really useful. Now, if you're in an organization that's smaller than that, it's still useful to have a look at those interview notes, those interview scores, to check that interviewers are measuring what they should be. So let's go on to what you want to assess. Now, this is where it starts to get complicated because we've got personality assessment. Hands up who uses personality assessment. Okay. What assessments do you use?
DISC.
Sorry?
DISC.
DISC? Eros? Okay. Haven't heard of that one. And what was another one? Thomas International. Yeah. So personality has a role to play. Things like derailers. So some of you might use the Hogan Development Survey, the so-called dark side. Helps to identify counterproductive behaviors that leaders might have. So personality is part of it. Cognitive ability or intelligence, so verbal, numerical, abstract reasoning and so on, often used with the graduate or managerial level. Behavior, and in behavioral assessment I'd include things like assessment centers, like interviews, but also online assessment. And we've got specific leadership measures, we've got knowledge, we've got technical skills. You've got a whole library of things that you could use, and perhaps some of you use a few or many of those. The question is, well, how do you decide what it is that you should be measuring? So we know that things like cognitive ability predict job performance to a point. We know that personality can as well. So you could use those for some roles or all roles. But what about the rest of these things? How do you decide what it is you should be measuring in the first place? Well, there's a few ways of doing that. So the sources of information to identify what to assess will include good old-fashioned job analysis. So what skills, behavior, knowledge is required to do the job well. Competency models. Many of you may have competency models in place. So you'd use competency models typically to create an interview or an assessment center to measure those things. You may use focus groups or subject matter experts to identify, again, what are the important things that people need to have to do this role, to then come up with a short list of these are the personality traits, or these are the skills, or this is the level of cognitive ability that might be required. May also look at professional academic literature. So when we're assessing for senior leaders, it's a really small group, so we don't have huge amounts of data to identify what makes a good leader. And also being a good leader at the very senior level is so contextual, you can't just use a cookie-cutter approach to it. So we might look at what the professional and academic literature is, might also connect with peer organizations and my assessment colleagues who work in other organizations to understand what they measure within leadership. And then if you have enough people doing the same or similar job, then you can look at the empirical evidence. You can look at the numbers. So you can identify, with a big enough group of people doing the same job, what does good look like in a much more validated way. So the way you do that is that you choose a group of higher and lower performers, or just assess everyone in that particular role. You administer the assessments, could be personality, cognitive, could be skills, could be anything you might want, and you compare the results. You identify how are the higher and lower performers differentiated in their assessment scores. So some are scoring higher, some are scoring lower. And from that, you can create a profile and compare candidates against that profile. So that can be done with a variety of assessment tools. So for example, with a personality assessment, you may want to identify what is it that differentiates your best sales performers. Well, give a bunch of them a personality assessment, and you will find that some of those scales are quite well correlated with job performance. So perhaps you might find that generally your highest performers tend towards extroversion rather than introversion. You might find that the higher performers are less anxious, the lower performers are more anxious. You could find a variety of things. But once you have that profile, you can compare your candidates to that fit, because what you're doing then is comparing your candidates to the highest performers. So that's one way of doing it if you have sufficient people doing a similar role to put that data together. But remember though that good changes. So what defines good job performance today is not necessarily what's going to define good performance tomorrow. So like a lot of industries, oil and gas is going through huge changes right now as they transition from oil and gas to other energies. So what's required of our leaders, as well as many other roles in the organization, is changing as well. So you need to anticipate, you need to be aware of what changes are coming along that might impact what good looks like in a particular role. So I put that there in just as a cautionary note. And then how do you assess, and what experience do you want the candidate to have? Well, how we assess, a whole range of things here. Some of these you'll use already. So application form and CV, of course. Interview, you can do in-person interview, do phone interview. You can do on-demand or live video interviewing. And more organizations are doing that because then it creates all kinds of cost savings rather than having candidates traveling around. It saves their time and is logistically much easier to manage. Assessment centers. I do love a good assessment center, but they are very expensive. So although they are valid, they give us a lot of information about candidates, they're not always a possibility. So rather than doing it in person, sometimes might run virtual assessment centers where people are dialed in using Skype or other technologies to participate in exercises. Online assessment, of course. So online assessments, the personality, the cognitive, the skills tests, and simulations and games. I'll come on to that last one in a moment. But what we've seen over the last few years is much more use of simulations and games for assessment. And that can provide two additional benefits over assessment. One is that simulations can provide a realistic job preview of what this job is like. And also games can be very valuable in the candidate experience and the attraction strategy as well. I'll give you an example of one of the assessment games in a moment. So when choosing assessments, we've got choice between low touch and high touch. So low touch are those automated, scalable solutions, those online assessments, things like personality, cognitive fit, cultural fit. Oh, hands up, anyone using a culture fit assessment? No, okay. High touch assessment are person to person. They're more resource intensive and include things like interviews, assessment centers. So when I'm choosing assessment, the questions to ask, well, we recap the first three questions. So what's the business need? What do you want to assess? And what candidate experience do you want? And also have to consider, do you want high touch or low touch? Because each of those has very different costs attached to it, and also different commitments in terms of time and resources and logistics. Do you buy it or build it? If you're using an online, if you have an online assessment, quite often you'll buy it in from any number of assessment vendors that are out there. But if it's an interview script or an assessment center, it's perfectly possible to build that in-house without having to buy that service in. Equally, if you are buying in from outside, do you want customized or off the shelf? Each of those is going to have advantages. Customized means it can reflect your competency model, it can reflect your organization, it can reflect the situations that candidates may encounter. But then again, off the shelf is generally much cheaper and may well deliver many of the same benefits. And then finally, the question for all assessments is, are they valid, reliable, and fair? So are they valid? Do they predict what it is you're trying to predict, which is future job performance? Are they reliable? So does everyone get to go through the same assessment, and are they treated fairly? So fairly in terms of impact due to gender, ethnicity, disability, and so on. Whatever the assessment, whether it's interview, or whether it's assessment center, or whether it's online assessment, ensure that it's valid, reliable, and fair. And if you are buying in assessments from an outside vendor, then they should be able to back that up because it makes your process then defensible. A few things that are new in assessment, just to finish up with. Multimedia assessments and simulations, seeing a lot more of those. So instead of having lots of text-based situations to read and respond to, use of animation and graphics and video makes it more engaging, and it tends to make for a more valid assessment. Seeing some hybrid assessments and job previews. There's a company in the US called Shaker Consulting who've got what they call a virtual job tryout, and it's part assessment and part job preview. So I think they did something for Starbucks. So you ask candidates to sit down, or they do it remotely. They see videos of what it's like to do the job, some typical customer interactions, and then they answer questions that are based within that context. So they have to do some numerical reasoning questions that look like some kind of Starbucks till receipt. And it mixes that job preview and assessment, alternates that. So by the end of it, the candidate has been assessed, but also they have a good idea of what the job entails, and they can decide whether it's really the right role for them. Assessment games. So there's a few assessment game publishers that are out there now. This was one example from a company called Rebellion. So replacing the traditional, potentially quite boring, multiple choice questionnaire with something more interactive and game-like. That has the advantage of making it more interesting for the candidate, but also, and there was some research I saw recently, is that they could potentially be more predictive or better predictors of performance than traditional assessments like intelligence tests. There's an example there. And finally, mobile assessment. So I don't know with your applicants how many of them are trying to apply on mobile devices. I don't know, for many of you using applicant tracking systems, they've had to evolve and adapt to make themselves mobile friendly. But we're finding that for candidates, not just who want to apply for a job, but also they want to take tests on mobile devices. So if you're engaged with any of the assessment vendors, one tip is to ask them about how candidates do when they're taking assessments on mobile devices and how well their assessments accommodate people taking it on tablets and phones. So that's a big trend that we're seeing within assessment right now. So I'm going to finish now, and I'll happily take any questions that we've got. But please do connect with me on LinkedIn if you like. I'm always happy to talk about assessment. So if you want to connect on LinkedIn, do feel free.